Matt, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to Tokyo and to Katsushika campus. And I'll now hand over to Matt to give our international keynote speech for JALTCALL 2025.
I think I should stop right here. This can't get any better. All right. Language learning with Gen AI, bridging the gap or burning the bridge. I'm doing something that is very unusual for me. I'm reading. I've prepared a kind of manuscript for the first part of this talk, and the rest I'll do as I normally do. So if you haven't heard me before, this is kind of unusual, so please bear with me for a little while. Prolegomenon. Like many, I have many questions about many matters in the field of artificial intelligence and how these impact and will continue to impact language education. One such question is hidden in the title of my talk. Can the advances in generative artificial intelligence, Gen AI, help bridge the gaps that exist in language education, or will they result in new gaps opening up and existing connections, bridges, being severed? For example, will each learner have their own knowledgeable and patient artificial language tutor, or will language learning become an awkward subject for the very few? Because the majority of people use machine translation for their language needs. I believe that we are all tasked with exploring answers to questions like these and to many others. And I hope that I'll be able to contribute to us finding some answers. That is why I've structured this keynote speech in 3 parts: an autoethnographic narrative, an analytical transition, and a philosophical exploration of 3 big questions. Autoethnography is a technical term for me telling you the story of my life. Selected, hopefully relevant parts of it. Making sense of the stories, both in their documented contexts and by targeting the research question. Learning more about what Gen AI is going to bring us, is going to bring language education. Quoting from Ellis, Adams, and Bogner, 2011, when researchers write autoethnographies, they seek to produce aesthetic and evocative thick descriptions of personal and interpersonal experience. They accomplish this by first discerning patterns of cultural experience evidenced by field notes, interviews, and/or artifacts, and then describing these patterns using facets of storytelling, especially character and plot development, showing and telling alterations of authorial voice. Thus, the autoethnographer not only tries to make personal experience meaningful and cultural experience engaging, but also by producing accessible texts, she or he may be able to reach wider and more diverse mass audiences that traditional research usually disregards. My goal is, and I quote again, to retrospectively and selectively write about epiphanies that stem from or are made possible by being part of a culture and or by possessing a particular cultural identity. End of quote. The Imitation Game, or Computers, Language and Learning in the Midst of Time, is the title of my autoethnographic story. The Imitation Game I borrowed from Alan Turing, often called the father of AI, and he lived from 1912 to 1954, and to whom, Alan Turing, we will return at the very end of this presentation. As in the narrative, I structure both the transition, which contains an analysis of the narrative, and my biography as a language learner and teacher, applied linguist and core researcher, and the big questions, which is a philosophical exploration of AI and language education today and tomorrow in 3 interconnected parts, focusing 1 on technology, 2 on language, and 3 on learning, always in turn. Ladies and gentlemen, before we begin our exploration of the current realm of generative AI, permit me a brief detour. In the summer of 2025, a man arrived at the Tokyo University of Science, carrying nothing but a backpack and a manuscript. What followed was not a lecture, but a disruption, one that altered the course of 3 disciplines and left behind a puzzle still unsolved. Let us begin there. Let us call the man with the manuscript Mathias. The Imitation Game, or Computers, Language, and Learning in the Midst of Time. This is the story of Mathias, who started learning Russian in school at the age of 9, who taught his first class at 19 during his national service, went to university thereafter to become a language teacher, and taught mainly German at universities in England, Canada, and the US, who got interested in computer-assisted language learning before he was 29, and at the time of DOS and Windows 3.1, who completed his PhD with a research prototype of a grammar checker for students of German after learning about symbolic natural language processing, NLP, with head-driven phrase structure grammar, HPSG, before he was 39, who co-wrote a book, Hived and Schulze 2007, and several encyclopedia and handbook articles on AI and CALL, which was called ICALL, as you just heard, including 1 chapter when he was 49, and who began to research the intersection of Gen AI and language education at the age of 59, when he also learned about the tokens, character strings, used in the machine learning for large language models. Prologue. June 16, 1963. Valentina Tereshkova, already wearing her spacesuit, was taken to the launch pad in Baikonur by bus. After she peed on the bus tire, in Yuri Gagarin's tradition, and as the first woman ever, Valentina orbited Earth in Vostok 6 for 3 days. This was the year Mathias was born. Vostok 6 did not have an onboard computer. Its mechanical and electromechanical systems were analog and hardwired. Only in 1980, the crew of the Soviet Soyuz T2 was the first to have such a machine on board. Argon 16, their board computer, weighed 70 kilogram and had 3 times 2 kilobytes of RAM. For comparison, one of the graphic cards that is used for creating these large language models, the NVIDIA H100, has a high bandwidth memory of 80 gigabyte, about 13,650 times as much as Argon 16. And here, high bandwidth means about 2 terabyte per second, equivalent to about 2 billion characters per second, or 429,500,000 words per second, or 171,800 texts per second. Part 1, Computer and the Helper Machine. The Berlin Wall had fallen a few months earlier. In 1990, after having completed his teacher training, Mathias stayed at the university for his doctoral studies. And soon after the Deutschmark came to East Germany on July 1st, 1990, Mathias bought a personal computer and found some software that had fallen off someone's desk. To conduct textual analysis for his doctoral dissertation project, he scripted a macro that compiled lists of word forms 2-form and 3-form sequences and their respective frequencies in WordPerfect, transferred the lists to PlanPerfect, a spreadsheet software also sold by the WordPerfect Corporation, to determine the connectedness of each 3-form sequence by calculating the probability with which the initial 2-form sequence is followed by the 3rd word form. He didn't know at the time that such sequences in texts were already called n-grams since 1979, and that they were the basis for statistical natural language processing and other work in computational linguistics. The most common n's are 2 and 3, the bigrams and trigrams, respectively. Also, in some applications, the n could get as big as 5. Various statistical analyses can be carried out using n-grams. But Mathias had never had classes in statistics, nor did he have any formal instruction in computing, never mind programming. So it was after a lot of reading that he came across the Pearson correlation coefficient. Using it, PlanPerfect could calculate the probability of a bigram being followed by a certain word form, a unigram, creating a more or less predictable trigram. After this worked with the macro for a single text and was painfully slow, even slower than the printing on a 24-pin dot matrix printer in its high-quality mode, which he used for printing dissertation drafts overnight while sleeping in the same rented room, Mathias wanted to learn a programming language to produce a faster textual analysis program, to produce a textual analysis program to analyze texts more efficiently. He had borrowed the Freiburger corpus, a spoken language corpus that consisted of 222 digitized transcripts that were sitting on an IBM mainframe computer in the basement of the Institut für Deutsche Sprache, the Institute for the German Language, in Mannheim, Germany. He visited the institute in 1991, and they copied the entire corpus from the mainframe computer to a set of 11 5¼ floppy disks for the personal computer. He looked puzzled when one of the researchers at the institute handed him the disks. "Was that just the first installment?" he asked. In the 222 transcriptions of the Freiburger corpus are spoken texts of a total duration of 68 hours and 6 minutes, recorded between 1955 and 1974. A little later, in 1991, Mathias taught German at Sunderland Polytechnic, which became Sunderland University. Serendipitously, he could use Turbo Prolog at that university. Turbo Prolog was the Borland version of Prolog, a declarative programming language. One programs rules in these rather than procedures. And people still use this in computational linguistics these days, for example, to write grammatical rules in symbolic natural language processing. This Mathias did not know in 1991. Only 4 years later, so, he used Prolog to write the rules of German morphology and syntax for the Grammar Checker project at the University of Manchester Institute of Science and Technology, UMIST, his second attempt at a doctoral dissertation project. The computer lab at the language department at Sunderland University, with its 20 standalone PCs, often stood empty. Mathias replicated the textual analysis program using Prolog, copied it onto the 20 computers, and ran an analysis on each one of them in parallel. One text of the 222 texts of the Freiburger corpus after another. Long lists of trigrams and their probable connectedness per this one text were the result. Such an analysis, lost my line, sorry. After another, long list of trigrams and their probable connectedness per this one text were the result. Such an analysis results were insufficient for a linguistic analysis. Matthias's dream of completing a doctoral dissertation at the University of Leipzig had been dashed. Later he learned that the results can only make sense if one runs the analysis over a large text corpus. Such an analysis could not have been performed by the computers of the language department. A single PC would have needed weeks, perhaps months, to analyze the entire Freiburger corpus. Until the summer of 1992, Matthias's first 2 years of computing were exciting and frustrating. It took another few months before he ventured into computer-assisted language learning. And then things took a turn. More on that later. Now we'll look at his beginnings in language learning. Part 2, resonant tongues, learning to speak. The year is 1972. Matthias is 9 years old and has just been told that he'll go to a different school. Like he, pairs of children had been selected by their classroom teachers in classes and schools across his small town. At the end of grade 2, he started grade 3 in the special class with the extended teaching of Russian. His other classmates from grade 2 would only begin to learn Russian as an obligatory subject in grade 5. First, they made him learn the Cyrillic alphabet, letter by letter. New vocabulary was given to him whenever the children had learned the letters needed to spell the word. Matthias saw Cyrillic as a secret code, which he augmented with the Tifinagh letters of the Berber language. He found a table of the Tifinagh letters in a children's book about the Tuareg people his grandma had given him. This mixed alphabet was his key to a secret code, a code he tried to share with his friends so that they could exchange secret messages. But not one of his friends wanted to learn the secret Cyrillic Tifinagh code. His strong initial interest inoculated him against seeing Russian as the language of the Soviet oppressor only. Initially, repeated translation and back translation of simple sentences fascinated him, and his own experiences ensured learning success in class, which sustained his motivation when his classmates were less engaged. Grammar, especially the declension of nouns and adjectives and the conjugation of verbs, was the other focus in Russian class. Matthias found the frequent textbook exercises on grammar and vocabulary easy. The frequent повторите, repeat, or все вместе, all together, so that the entire class would repeat what the teacher just said, bored him. Already in grade 5, his whole class of 24 students would sit in the language lab once or twice a week, connected in pairs across the rows, and practice a partner dialogue on a practical topic like personal introductions or giving directions to a place in town. Most of the time in Russian class, they were practicing linguistic forms. On the other hand, the pictures, examples, and texts, as you can also see on the slide, in their books, not only in Russian class, had prevalent ideological meaning infused. He did not know what was said about his Russian class in the curriculum issued by the Ministry for People's Education, led by the wife of the head of state. And I quote, "The main task of the extended teaching of Russian consists of developing comprehensively and in a planful manner students' abilities and skills in spoken and written language use based on solid lexical and grammatical knowledge. Priority is given to activities in listening and speaking. The Russian language needs to be utilized in different genres in everyday life. Correspondence, student meetings, cultural programs in the Russian language, watching Soviet films in movie theaters, etc. So that students can utilize the Russian language as a means of communication. Already in beginners' classes, students get used to Russian as the classroom language and language of instruction." Matthias was told that Russian was not only the language spoken by our friends in the big brother state Soviet Union, he also learned that it was an important language not only of the countries of the Eastern Bloc, but many developing countries, especially in Africa. He then started learning English, his second foreign language, when he was 13, in line with the centralized state curriculum. In most weeks, Mathias had to watch TV as homework in the early afternoon. The half-hour educational show, English for You. Let's watch a clip. Let's see whether this works.
500 books before he wrote Capital. How many books had he read before he wrote Capital? Marx had read 1,500 books before he wrote Capital. But now let's learn something else about Karl Marx, viewers. Tom wants to show Peggy some other interesting things about Karl Marx. He wants to show her the Marx Memorial Library. Look, viewers, here's a picture of the Marx Memorial Library.
Right. Once a week, they would also meet in the language lab, and when the teacher was neither looking nor listening in, they played airplanes with the headsets, rather than taking turns filling out blanks in the textbook exercises or practicing a dialogue. He found the communicative situations as far-fetched and uninteresting as the listening and reading texts. Imagine you're meeting a comrade from a developing country who doesn't speak neither German nor Russian. He needs to go to the post office. Please give him clear directions. And Mathias did many times. When he was 26 years old, he met the first speaker of English from an English-speaking country at Leipzig University. That was after his teacher training. Part 3, parsers and pedagogues always catching up. Mathias continued his language learning at university. At least one class a day in groups of 6 for 6 days a week, and during the third year abroad in Kaluga, a city 200 kilometers south of Moscow, at the Pedagogical Institute. His other classes in teacher training were in German literature from the Middle Ages to today, and in Russian and Soviet literature over 300 years, both over a couple of semesters, and then literary theory and world literature. In phonetics, phonology, morphology, lexicology, syntax, text linguistics, history of the language for both German and Russian, always in this, the structuralist order, each for one semester. In Marxist philosophy, dialectical and historical materialism, political economy, and the propagandistic scientific communism. And in the history of pedagogy, general pedagogy, didactics, German, first language teaching methodology, Russian, second language teaching methodology of literature, teaching observations, teaching practice, and a one semester teaching internship. And in general, developmental and learning psychology. That kept Mathias busy and mostly out of trouble for 5 years. He grew a beard and wore sandals and tried to look like a budding professor. Much later, he realized that his learning of German grammar and language history, both at school and at university, came in very handy for explaining language constructions to learners of German. It was years later that he understood that what he had learned as activity theory in psychology and pedagogy at university, sorry, and that was associated with Soviet psycholinguists like Leontiev and Galperian, was published in the American journal Soviet Psychology between 1962 to 2022 under different journal names in early and late years by Taylor and Francis, the same publisher as the Cold Journal, and became known as sociocultural theory, especially in North America. In applied linguistics, Lev Vygotsky, who was born in 1896 and passed away of tuberculosis at the age of 37 in 1934 was and still is quoted in translation like he is among the living. Mathias learned about Vygotsky's concept of zona ближайшего развития, the zone of proximal development. And since you're about to interrupt and ask, no, Vygotsky did not coin the term scaffolding. That was Wood, Brunner, and Ross in 1976. Mathias learned more about Alexei and Leontiev, who lived from 1903 to 1979, who was a close collaborator and student of Vygotsky and became a prominent figure in Russian psychology. And about his son, Alexei A. Leontiev, 1936 to 2004, and thought he met the grandson, Dmitry Leontiev, but that was another person by the same name. The actual grandson is still a prominent researcher in psychology at Lomonosov University in Moscow today. In the psychology classes, Mathias studied the components of the activity systems, with activity being the main unit of analysis, as grandfather Leontiev coined them. The collective subject, the mediating artifact, орудие, and the abstract material, object of the activity. Equally important was Leontiev's distinction of the intentional action and the conditional operation. Both became important for Mathias's research in that they help distinguish the intention-driven actions of a human and the condition-triggered operations of a machine. Mathias heard lectures based on East German pedagogy textbooks. These, in turn, were based on the concepts of Soviet psychologist Pyotr Galperin, also in the School of Activity Theory. He learned to structure his learning activities, lesson plans, in line with the stepwise formation of mental actions. They went through 6 stages with their order, and the order and completeness was somewhat flexible, not only in Mathias's practical teaching. And the 6 stages are motivational and orienting stage, material action stage, perceptual action stage, and only then is the verbal action stage, and is the external speech, so it's loud. Then is the next verbal action stage, the inner speech, and then is the mental action stage, the kind of actual thinking. So Mathias learned that the most important step is to orient and motivate students early in the activity. Galperin called this the orienting basis of the action. North American sociocultural theory called it SCOBA, schema for conceptualizing the orienting basis of the activity. Mathias always found the underlying theoretical principles important. Important to fully understand certain methods and approaches, and important to be able to reflect on one's teaching. And teacher reflection is the single best practice for successful teachers. Yet he also cared about the very practical application of different technologies in his teaching, and soon that of his colleagues. The technologies Mathias learned about and was tested on in teacher training in the late 1980s were the slide projector, the overhead projector, and the record player, and a few others. It was only when he began to teach at Manchester Metropolitan University in England that he wanted to, and was tasked with, using computers in his language teaching. Briefly, he also taught a course on computing for language students in the early 1980s, because his class was the first opportunity for some students to have to operate a computer. That changed quickly. The first program he used with his students was To-Go-To, a program for German grammar with fill-in-the-blank and multiple-choice questions that had been created by Amtraud F. Taylor and Werner Haas at Ohio State University. Togo 2 came on 3.5-inch floppy disks. Some students proudly told Mathias that they had done all grammar exercises that the disk had to offer. Mostly fill in the blank for different grammatical constructions like the dative case or the past of strong verbs. For this work, students sat in the Tandberg Computer Lab. Tandberg was a Norwegian company that also produced the language labs of old and worked on large desktop PCs whose keyboards and monitors were wired together through the teacher's desk. And Mathias controlled them from there by sending his or a student's screen to the entire group, monitoring an individual student, and by disabling their keyboards and monitors when he needed their attention for the next phase of the lesson. To help students study in their own time and to integrate the different CALL software programs into the syllabus of different language courses and their textbooks, Mathias wrote the booklet Students' CALL Guide to help them orient themselves with these digital resources that were available to them. All the software was text-based and often ran under DOS and did not make use of Windows. The use of multimedia was still in its infancy. When his colleague Chris Jones took ill, Mathias completed the scripting of Gertie, a multimedia vocabulary learning program with a toolbook. Gertie's chapters were based on one picture, for example, of a bathroom at a home. Each of the items in the picture was clickable. For example, if someone clicked the towel or the tub, the German word would be shown and the sound file with the spoken form would be played. After this presentational learning phase, the vocabulary could be practiced using the same pictures and hyperlinks. For a while, Mathias's department in Manchester had used the textbook German, A Structural Approach by Lorenz and Strassman. This textbook was bundled with CALLIS, Computer-Aided Language Instruction System, an authoring tool that employed regular expressions used for providing individualized and contingent corrective feedback on sentence-based exercises. Regular expressions have well-defined special characters and are used, have well-defined special characters and syntax that makes them look like mathematical functions so that they can be used to match sets of character patterns. Mathias must have been one of the few language instructors who love scripting feedback loops using CALLIS and its regular expressions. In a way, a step towards natural language processing, which is a branch of artificial intelligence research. Mathias began to learn about computational linguistics, natural language processing, student modeling, and machine translation. Welcome to church. When he went across the street from the Manchester Metropolitan University to the University of Manchester Institute of Science and Technology and its Center for Computational Linguistics. He taught full-time German, linguistics and CALL, and began working towards his PhD in language engineering. Alan Ramsey, his doctoral supervisor, taught him the basics of natural language processing and let him use the parser that he had developed and that was being expanded for a variety of languages. The field of ICALL, people applying AI to CALL, was very small in the 1990s and had only been around for very few years when Mathias started. In 1998, his UMIST colleague Marie-José Amel and he organized a small conference on natural language processing and CALL. Its proceedings were published the year after as the first ever special issue of Recall. A year after that, interested colleagues encouraged Mathias to form the Eurocall Special Interest Group in Natural Language Processing. Later it was called ICALL and had a strong collaboration and overlap with the Special Interest Group of the same name in Calico. In the early 2000s, through the IFTA, Mathias chaired both special interest groups and organized a number of pre-conference workshops in ICALL to bring the few ICALL researchers interested in AI and NLP together. Special issues and other publications were the result. talking about publications. One evening at the World Call Conference in Banff, Canada, in 2003, Trude and Matthias happened to sit across the table from an acquisition editor of Sweats and Zeitlinger, a small publisher in the Netherlands who also produced the Call journal, and had started a book series on Call under the editorship of Carol Chappell and Graham Davis. By the end of the evening, Trude and Matthias were planning to combine their PhD theses, both had been written and defended and were on ICALL and German, and to use these theses as a springboard for their work on the first monograph on ICALL. Since Sweats and Zeitlinger were taken over by Taylor and Francis, their book came out as a Routledge imprint in 2007. In the book, Matthias discussed 119 ICALL projects that were published between 1978 and 2004. Trude did more of the empirical parts. The literature on ICALL was scattered across different fields: Call, computers and education, computational linguistics, natural language processing, artificial intelligence and education, and so on. Many of them went unnoticed by Call researchers and practitioners at the time. Udo Jung, for example, in one of his published Call bibliographies, lists 11 publications under artificial intelligence, 7 under parser. He always has those keywords there for his bibliography, and under ICALL, and only 2 under ICALL. Among the 558 that he actually found, and he had overlooked many. Over the years, Matthias wrote several pieces on ICALL, but then there came a time when he was busy with other projects, being in the Department of Germanic and Slavic Studies at the University of Waterloo in Canada. And he had less and less time to dedicate to writing a computational grammar and programming other aspects of an intelligent tutoring system. As a trained linguist, he was not overly interested in using statistics, and to learn it first, to capture language and explain language. He published the last article on ICALL in 2008 and the last handbook chapter on ICALL in 2016 with Cornelia Chisholm. It was only in early 2023 that Matthias dusted off his old records and started writing about AI again. He felt a voice of historical reason was needed again. I talked with him recently, and he's still a little overwhelmed by the speed and breadth of development of Gen AI, but insists that knowing what happened before the explosion of Gen AI is important also for language teachers. And perhaps even more important, it is not to forget, when faced with a chatbot, what we already know about language and language education. Here we will leave Matthias and his story and transition away from a personal perspective to a much more objective view. So that's the transition point. Why was I doing this kind of very personal story? Basically to illustrate, yes, machines have changed a lot. Computers have changed a lot. Things we take for granted today have not always been like that. They feel permanent to probably all of us. They're not, of course, permanent, as any Buddhist will tell you. What is interesting for me, and this is something I believe that gotten lost in the discourses of computer-assisted language learning. Computer-assisted language learning pretty much started off as the interaction of the learner with the machine. Now think for a moment what we are doing with Gen AI. It is the interaction of the learner with the machine. The chatbot is a machine. What we did in the years before, at least since, as Carol Chappell said in a 97 article, since 1997, predominantly call all the things, just gonna say it, you grew up with in some way, were computer-mediated communication. We talked about social media, we talked about wikis, we talked about Second Life, we talked about all sorts of chat things and whatever. This is communication via the computer, used for language learning. It's a very different animal. It's still human communication, but mediated by a machine. What we are doing with a chatbot is communication with a machine. The Gricean maxims of communication, you've got them in the corner there in the bottom right, do not apply. You cannot trust the machine. And that's nothing bad about the machine. I like machines. They can't do it because they do not, a computer does not perform actions, as Leontief would call them. There is no intention in a machine. There's only conditions because you clicked something. That's why it did it. There is no intention. It doesn't want to give you an answer. It has no intention of answering your prompt. You just put the prompt there and clicked. That's why it does it. That's it. A condition was met and then the machine was triggered. That is very important to kind of bear in mind in some way. Because if we don't, we lose agency. We're anthropomorphizing, we're making the machine a human, we're treating them as humans. And then they take over. So yes, these AI overlords are possible if we don't watch it. And I really mean the we, because we are the teachers. If we don't teach those things, who will do that? That's why we are called teachers. That's our task, particularly when we work with language, whatever the language is. Now on language, since we're there, with my probably, for many of you, exotic examples, I think I can highlight the fact that applies to all languages that are learned, any context. Of course there's an ideology behind it. It's no coincidence that the languages we teach are all kind of imperial languages, most of them. And there's a lot of discussion about post-colonialism and things like that. Those are ideologies too. We kind of weave them in, we need to reflect on them once in a while, and it helps to look back also for those things. And it's particularly important, yes, this is relevant for Gen AI, because those are the things we can contribute to that discussion. That's what we have to watch out for. So when we complain about hallucinations or stuff like that, or biases that are introduced in the conversation based on a large language model, we collectively wrote those texts before and there are our own biases. So really, do we want to perpetuate them in some way? For me, language learning, I have nothing against culture whatsoever. But my focus has always been on the development of proficiency. That's what my research was about in many ways. That's why I'm so interested in grammar and things like that. Proficiency is the conglomerate of complexity, accuracy, and fluency. You need all three to develop proficiency. What we do in language teaching very often, to this day, is we're focusing on accuracy a lot, which is also the surface one, is the one about expected construction. Really what we consider to be accurate is things we know, things we've heard often. And we start thinking, oh, I haven't heard that one. Well, if it's from Goethe or Shakespeare, we think it's brilliant. If it's from one of our students, we say, this is a mistake. But we're over-focusing on accuracy. In order to develop proficiency, we need to kind of look at all three. And then, because it's a rectilinear distance, you always have to go around the block. You have to go through all three of them. Learning. If we, I also like to think about words, especially in those years when I started learning a language, it was about mastery. There was a concept in pedagogy called mastery learning. The concept that was very prevalent when Call started was programmed learning, a Skinnerian idea, a behaviorist idea, basically. So we talk about mastering a language, right? So we are the master of a language, or we are training somebody to become the master of a language. When you then look at the German is worse. You're ruling the language. You're commanding the language, basically. And the Russian, you're possessing it. It's yours now. Molded it and have. Those metaphors matter. especially when we use them with kids, right? Especially when we use them in times of technologies that help us to kind of spread this extraordinarily quickly. So we do need to reflect on it at least once in a while, basically, and take a step back and say, what are we talking about here? A lot of my language learning, and I would think a lot of your language learning, was actually language practice. It wasn't really language use of some kind. Neither Russian or English, my foreign languages, I was in a little town, I didn't have access to, we would literally go to the Soviet barracks and chat up the poor guard who stood there and was happy to talk to some boys, basically. We would say hello and give him our names and, I don't know, point out that the door was red or whatever the vocabulary we had and found exciting. So we're not really using the language in the second language context to its full capacity, what it's really meant for. Right? So often there is limited resources and there's limited access to language exposure, to use a kind of technical term. And that is an area where Gen AI can be of extreme positive use for exposure. Literally, conversations, they're called chatbots and not teachers. All right, last part. We're almost done, so bear with me. The big questions. And again, they're on technology first. I really believe this has a lot, this whole of AI, not just generative AI, has a lot to do with agency. Why is this so problematic? I'll give you an example. There's a book by Henry Kissinger with 2 co-authors, which he couldn't even finish before he passed away, but he was kind of almost done. So the other 2 finished it. And they also think about this kind of machine learning idea that's underneath. And that was what changed from all the things I talked about with ICALL. What changed in 2022, of course, not just that year, a little bit earlier, was machine learning. All of a sudden, the paradigm was different. So the power of these technologies increased exponentially. And that kind of happens very often in technologies. It's not something unusual in some way. So Kissinger then says, well, if we do machine learning, and already people are on record, OpenAI, for example, has published their numbers about GPT-3. They've not published their numbers on GPT-4. We don't know how many parameters this thing has. We don't know how many hidden layers there are. And we've got a couple of, if I say I don't understand how this whole thing works or whatever, okay, fine. If the person who designed it says in writing, I have no idea what's going on in the middle there, we're kind of puzzled. The machine has done it. And if you then add those humongous numbers that I gave you just with this throughput rate, basically, yes, this is beyond human comprehension. So if we leave that to the machines, we have no idea whether the machines all of a sudden start programming this through their machine learning in a different way. Jill Burstyn, who is one of the kind of main persons in automated writing assessment, is working kind of for a different company now, and they're kind of still scraping text off the internet, partially to do with testing and things like that. She gave this presentation at AAL, the American Association for Applied Linguistics, where she was talking, saying, well, we have too few texts, even for English, to expand the models, basically. We need more texts. We can't get them. The New York Times is suing us, or whatever. What they then suggest is, why don't we use texts that are generated? So that's the kind of beginning of the machine learning from the machine, learning from the machine, learning from the machine. I don't think anybody really understands, I'm on thin ice here, but I don't think anybody really understands how much this will change the whole game, basically, in many ways. Language. the most important thing for us. Yes, we all care about this technology, and it is fascinating, but really our bread and butter is the kind of language side of things. What is unique about the human language? That was the question Yule asked in many of the textbook versions that were published of that book. And those are the 6 properties of the human language Yule came up with. Any one of them is not unique. It exists for other languages, as in bird language or bee language, or better word, communication systems, basically. But the combination of the 6, according to Yule, is unique. It's unique to our human language. And you see things like cultural transmission, and I see a couple that have dotted lines, which means I am very doubtful that a machine, generative AI, can actually do those. The other one is the language functions that have been discussed in linguistics. So 2 main functions of language. One is the communicative function, we use it to communicate, blah, 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 blah. And it's a cognitive function. Yes, we use language to think. And it has a couple of other functions. I can be performative, like I can promise something. And the moment I say it, I've done it. I've created the promise, basically. So I'm performative with language. And of course, we need it for social identity or whatever. You're kind of judging me by my accent, the words I use, how fast I speak, and all those things. All of those are kind of very difficult to do by a machine, because the machine has no intention. Why would it want to create an image of itself? It's also not self-aware. We are. Machines are not. The machine saves things and whatever, but it's not really aware of what it is doing. So the language that gets created is plausible. The forms look nice. And I'm going to use a kind of strange phrase. They make sense. And that is incorrect. They don't make sense. We make sense. When the computer does not, whether this is ChatGPT or Copilot or even Grok or whatever, they don't create meaning. We read it. We imbue the text with meaning. Now take this to language learning. What we are doing as teachers, we're having the student generate a text, whatever that is, with whatever innocent prompt. What we're asking them to do in another language, in a second language, is to imbue that text that was generated by a machine with meaning. That is hard. That is very, very hard. And it surely doesn't help with learning. Learning then is an illusion. Then, now the first articles about this illusion of learning. The easiest way to explain it is a very obvious one. We've come across it. Like when we read something in an old-fashioned book, the moment we read it, we are so sure we know it. Then we close the book and somebody asks us to repeat it, and we can't. It's that illusion, right? It's kind of a normal cognitive feature, basically, or bug, if you want. So the same thing happens in students' interaction with a chatbot of however sophisticated this chatbot is. You get the answer very speedily, it's instant satisfaction, and then you think, oh, wow, yeah, that's clear, I get it. I just need to save it, copy, done. It doesn't leave any traces, basically, it doesn't impact. It does not cause learning, as we used to say in the olden days. And another interesting one, and I've actually done that on the students. I kind of point out my gray hair as though they haven't seen it yet. And I say, well, you can make the assumption that I've been working at university and teaching German for quite a while. Because, look at me. But, on the other hand, I'm still here. They're still paying me. So I can't be that bad. I'm probably not lying to you. So even, especially if you don't know, you might as well take your chances and trust me. And that's a teachability phenomenon. We all have that because that's why we teach at institutions. That's why we give people ranks and titles and funny things like that, basically, and dress them up in a weird way in some institutions, in order to build this initial unreasonable trust, basically, so that we can teach. Because we can only learn things we believe. We cannot even read something that we don't take at face value. The questioning always comes afterwards. Yeah, for reading, understanding a text, you need to believe it. Otherwise, it doesn't work. That's cognition. That's why so few people question news or whatever they've read, because it's an additional step. It takes work and takes time, takes effort. Now, because of the coming back, kind of making these chatbots human, we're still thinking, oh yeah, they're kind of human and we're going to make them the same. No, they should not perhaps have the same bonus a teacher gets in terms of believing them. And students cannot check up on the chatbot necessarily, and they cannot check up on the teacher either, but it seems to be less necessary to check up on the teacher. All right, that was the three big questions. I promised you we're going to return to Alan Turing. This memorial is in Manchester, as you can see in the Sackville Gardens. I used to work right at the back of that park, basically. The reason why Alan Turing's memorial is there's an interesting snippet. Alan Turing was gay. And of course, in the 1950s, he wasn't, if you've seen The Imitation Game, you'll have seen a soft, cleaned up version of it, basically. He couldn't live his homosexuality, basically. It was literally dangerous. And people believe that's why he committed suicide, basically, in 1954. He died of suicide. And he died with a poisoned apple. And this apple, of course, has all sorts of kind of different metaphor for many different things. Newton's apple and things like that. So kind of that's why the artist did this. And the artist kind of put this up, which I was very happy about, literally weeks and months before I left Manchester, basically. So I still saw it when it went up. Alan Turing, in his 1950 paper, called it the imitation game. Today, we call it the Turing test. That's the main proof in many people's mind, right? It's kind of almost like a cliche, this Turing test. That's what it is. You get the kind of, it's a little bit longer than that, it's a full paper. But it's very, very simple. And many people have argued with it. I used to believe it for many, many years. I always thought, yeah, oh, clever. It's so simple, right? You have a screen, you have a machine, and the human behind that screen, and the person in front of the screen needs to figure out which is which, basically. And just through conversation, asking them questions. The one thing I hadn't thought about, there's a very easy way to find out which one is the machine. You simply give it a mathematics problem. You basically say, how much is 1,769 times 1,354? If this thing comes out with an answer immediately, it's the machine. You can be 100% sure. There are very few humans who can do that very quickly. Philosophers have argued about this since. Searle, one of the people in speech act theory, came up with the Chinese room experiment. Anybody heard about this? Yeah. So Searle, who didn't have any Chinese whatsoever, was sitting in a room. They only had slots, nobody could see him. And Chinese speakers would be outside of that room, and they could feed questions in Chinese, using Chinese characters, and kind of put them through a kind of letterbox slot, basically. And in the room were lots and lots of manuals on Chinese characters and Chinese syntax and vocabulary and all sorts of things, mechanical things, basically. So being a clever guy, he could compile those things, thought experiment, right, in the paper. And then he would write out the answer, kind of figure out what the question was, write out the answer, and put it back. The Chinese speakers outside of the room started believing the person in the room spoke Chinese. And so said, no, I don't speak Chinese. I rest my case. So kind of he then basically said, no, you can't prove intelligence that way. But on the other hand, we don't yet have a way of proving intelligence, and so on. Conclusions. Computers have been much more potent now, much more sophisticated, but we've also lost a couple of things. See, the limitations of use and the transparency of these operations have decreased. So yes, we can do many more things, to put it positively, with a machine, with a computer, things we might have not even thought of earlier, but it's becoming more and more opaque. And that has its own problem. Yes, we can have all sorts of conversations with the chatbots, and yes, they can pretend to be all sorts of things. And they can even pretend to be a teacher. But if you think, would you have a human who speaks fluently, who you just kind of met on the street, and said, hey, you, come here. You teach this person English, or you teach them whatever, just chat with them, talk with them, pretend to be a teacher, please be a teacher. We would not do that. We're asking a machine to do that. And lastly, there's a historian, Harari, who says AI should not stand for artificial intelligence, it should stand for alien intelligence. And he's not talking about other planets or stuff like that. What he means is this intelligence of these machines already is alien to us. It's very, very different from ours, basically. It can do things extremely well, far better than we ever can. And it does other things where you think, geez, you can't get that right now. So this might result in new ways of knowing, in new ways of thinking about things. We have the chance to use these machines, yes, to find out things. With our human limitations, we might not have been able to find out. So, and again, that's, I think, a challenge for us teachers in many ways. Kind of looking, what is the new thing there? So, not just generating lesson plans and things like that, sorry, I'm being a little bit flippant there, but actually thinking, how can we interact with those machines? How can we help the younger generation in order to make some progress there? I've been thinking a lot about AI recently. So there are a couple of other conclusions that I drew in those papers and things like that, that I didn't want to repeat here because it's a very kind of complex problem, but there are, of course, many, many more things than I had the time to say, and I'm very well aware of the time. So I'll finish here, and thank you very much. Looking to be have a minute or two for questions. How are we doing? I know should have finished at 3, but wait over a little. You also had a long introduction, Michael.
We noticed.
Okay.
Hi, I really appreciate your bringing up the Chinese room, the roles, because that's still considered strong by most researchers in terms of what distinguishes general AI with humans. However, I just written a paper about this. May I raise a provocative point? So one of the reasons is that this human agency that we think we have this self-awareness and that first cause is a critical term in Searle's paper, is that that's being associated with an activity in temporal parietal junction that's coming out of neuroscience research. When we think that we're causing this particular activity, the particular region in the brain activates. And then the research is still controversial research, even goes back to 1980s, where our actions, in fact, is a post hoc justification. We actually act first, and then when we make up reasons that yes, we are actually doing this. So this there's been a lot of replication studies that's been still disputed even now. And I wonder what makes us human is that we are delusional enough to think that our actions are the ones that we are causing it, where the AI is not delusional enough to think they're the first cause. Now, if that's the case, can we add a module to AI to have that illusion? How would I'm curious.
That's a very good point. I like that. Well, I really have nothing to add to that. You said it pretty well. I have something in parallel that goes with this from conversation we know. So like two people are talking to one another. One person says something, auditory channel, or whatever. The other person does not react to what we just said. They react to how they reasoned about our intention. So when we hear something, when you heard my lecture, you are constantly thinking, what is he talking about? Why is he saying those things? Why is he on about this now? What is going on here? What is he trying to tell me? Because that determines how you're going to react. So I would think if we then assume that the machines don't reason in that way, they also react in a very different way. And then, yeah, it's parallel basically to what you just said. Thank you.
But Matt, if you extend the current reasoning which you just brought up, that in fact the construction of meaning happens in the conversation, then if people are interacting with AIs and they are constructing meaning from that, doesn't that mean that there is actual discourse occurring there? And isn't that a big part of what we're looking at right here? We're looking at these AIs as a way to provide some kind of supplementary discourse for language learning.
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
Is the quicker. I don't know whether this was audible in the back. The question is, if we are, in my words, basically, if we are imbuing the text that was just generated with meaning, or the students do, there is meaning in these chatbot conversations, or the conversations we have with the chatbot. Does this mean it is a genuine discourse? Is it a genuine conversation? The one thing I would say is, as with all other things, it's in our mind, right? We determine. That's why I believe that's the main reason why Harari calls it alien intelligence. As long as we reflect on it, I believe, as long as we reflect on those processes, as long as we are aware, as long as I am aware that when I interact with ChatGPT, which is the main one I'm using these days, that I'm interacting with a machine, and that I have to kind of sometimes take things with a pinch of salt and double check them in some way, or I, need to be happy with a certain answer because that's the answer I'm going to get from a machine. I think I'm good. It's going to be very helpful. Yes, there were a couple of things where this machine helped me think also for this paper in some way. I could have never gotten those images off the internet. Some of them, they kind of presented them in exactly the way I wanted it, basically. And I cannot draw or manipulate photographs or anything of that kind. I've never learned those skills. I think we need to wrap up, right? Thank you very, very much.